If you want a science fiction story, you'll almost certainly have some kind of faster-than-light travel in it. It's by no means necessary. The Martian is a great book, and in theory we could do just about everything in it right now. But for the most part, people expect to be gallivanting around the galaxy at speeds faster than light can go, and for us super nerds, we like an explanation for how that kind of thing works. After all, the only way you can reach FTL speeds requires, as we understand it, infinite energy, which is impossible. As a result, most sci-fi settings have a way around this, giving us all sorts of fun ways to tell Albert Einstein to get bent. The game FTL is jump beacons you can catapult yourself to and from. Halo has slip space, which varies from the wormhole dimension to the terrifying realm of shadow and darkness that corrupts space-time itself, depending on if the Forerunners and Flood are involved. And in 40k, we've got plenty of options to choose from. If you need to get somewhere quick, there's no better option than the warp, and at the same time, there's no worse option. Jump into hell and roll those dice. The Elder have the Webway, the Necrons have the home invasion version of the Webway, the Tyranids have gravity. If you can think of it, you can probably find an FTL type in Warhammer, so let's discuss the standout ways that people in 40k throw themselves across the galaxy. Because in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, if you don't have something to pull up on your enemies at with a moment's notice with, then you just can't cut it as a faction. But before we begin, did you know it's just about summer? A time to be enjoying the outdoors, the nice fresh air, and all the benefits of this time of year. And if you're like me, you enjoy listening to something while you take a walk or do whatever else, in which case I have the perfect thing for you, Raycon, the sponsor of this video. Introducing the Raycon Everyday Headphones. These bad boys are the perfect thing to take with you on a nice summer walk, while you clean the house, or anything else. At half the price of other brands, they're already putting their best foot forward, but that's hardly all they have to offer. For one, a 40-hour battery life. You can use them for almost 2 days straight before they need a recharge, which is perfect for those of us who tend to forget electronics need electricity to work. And aside from giving you high-quality sound, they're also incredibly comfortable to wear because of the ergonomic design. I like to throw them on when I work on a script, because between the comfort, the quality, and the active noise cancellation, they help me drown out the world and focus all that much more on what I'm doing. And to make sure you get yourself the finest headphones on the market today, I've got just the thing for you. Experience premium sound wherever you go by heading to buyraycon.com/PancreasNoWork15 to get yourself 15% off site-wide. That's buyraycon.com/PancreasNoWork15 or the link in the description and pinned comment for 15% off site-wide. When you listen to music, podcasts, and more, you deserve only the finest, so get yourself Raycon's Everyday Headphones today to make all your audio all the better. Now then, time to outrun the Rebel fleet. FTL in Warhammer is, as I said at the start, fairly varied. Much like early Stellaris, there's multiple types of FTL travel, even if one of them is the most common. As current-day Stellaris has hyperdrive travel as the most common, so too does 40k have warp travel as the most common. A good amount of the factions make use of the warp to some degree or other to get around, and naturally some do it better and some do it worse. Although as you'll come to find out, better and worse are almost completely relative to the factions involved. First off, of course, is the Imperium. Imperial warp travel is one of those things that probably has gotten a lot of people into the setting after it's described to them. A young Warhammer fan in the making asks, hey, I see this cool sci-fi setting and those ships look cool, how do they get around? And then someone responds that they get around by jumping feet first into literal hell, which is naturally going to intrigue almost anyone. Sure enough, that's how the Imperium of Man gets around, utilizing the warp to achieve faster than light travel. Consequently, every time they do so, as I said, they're rolling the dice on things going well. Before I get into the various issues they face, I will say that the Imperium is smart enough to realize that jumping into hell on blind faith alone is a truly horrible idea. Except for maybe a ship entirely crewed with Sisters of Battle, but that generally isn't a thing. So the various methods the Imperium uses to keep things safe are instead employed. First off is the Astronomicon. This is the most important thing there is for large-scale warp travel. With how tumultuous the warp can be, something to act as a lighthouse for anyone traveling is a necessity. Created by Big E himself, initially this was more of a stopgap measure. The Emperor wanted to eventually instead convert to using the Webway, which we'll talk about later, but for the time being that wasn't anything close to feasible even for him, so instead the big lighthouse was created. After the Horus Heresy, this was the only option remaining between Magnus breaking the Webway project and Horus breaking the Emperor, so now we're just stuck with it. The Astronomicon manifests as a massive flame of golden light, filling the minds of anyone who can detect it with images of holy saints and the Emperor and all the gothic imagery that makes the setting so fun. Since the average person looking into the warp just results in insanity at best, the Imperium instead uses navigators to detect the Astronomicon and guide a ship through the warp. While it isn't perfect, without the Astronomicon and navigators, there'd be no Imperium. Since it's so important, the Astronomicon is maintained alongside the Emperor by way of feeding him roughly 1,000 psychers a day to keep it going. This is one of the most brutal fates in the setting since it completely drains the soul of the Psyker in question into the Emperor and Astronomicon. Prior to this, they're of course in excruciating pain, and if I remember correctly, it's so brutal that the devices used are actually self-cleaning, because when they're done, the Psykers just turn into ash. Get a broom and you're ready for the next guy to have his soul sucked. The Astronomicon also causes something called the Fire Tide, which although I believe was only mentioned in the book Talons of Horus, I don't think has been properly retconned, so it's still worth talking about. Where the light of the Astronomicon touches the Eye of Terror, it creates the Fire Tide. It's a giant wall of golden flame that scours planets clean and manifests insane rage demons of the Emperor. They really hate chaos, but they also just go berserk on anyone who comes close. It's also created a nicer fellow known as Imperius, an avatar of Big E who's overall pretty chill. For the opposite of chill, however, it's usually a wise idea to not mention that the Astronomicon worked perfectly fine without the Emperor sitting on the Golden Throne. I don't know how your average Imperial would come across this information, but if they did, it'd be best to keep it to themselves so they don't get beaten and killed for heresy reasons. The Astronomicon is all well and good, but it's more of a large-scale thing. It allows the Imperium to function galactically, but individual ships still need their own protection. A lighthouse warning you of danger, after all, is useless if you have no means of avoiding the danger, and so we come to the second mainstay of Imperial warp travel, the Geller Field. The Geller Fields of an Imperial ship are a sort of shield around them activated when transitioning through the warp. It essentially allows for a bubble of real space to be maintained around the ship, keeping all the nasty things that would otherwise get in, out. The Geller Field is a mechanical thing. The machine that makes it is mechanical in nature, and not entirely magical warp nonsense. That being said, magical warp nonsense is of course still involved. Though off the top of my head I can't remember if I read this in official lore, I feel comfortable saying that part of the reason Imperial ships are blinged out in golden statues of the Emperor is partly because it actually helps to drive off the warp more effectively. Belief is a tangible thing in 40k, and so the belief that these statues actually help strengthen the Geller Field in turn causes it to be so. The other bit of magical warp nonsense is the sleeping Psyker, whose dreams help power the field as well. This is a bit newer to official lore, but within GW writers, this was apparently something that was more or less always taken as fact. The dreams of this Psyker help create and sustain the field, which to me is kind of like fighting fire with fire, and I mean that in the productive slash and burn kind of way to stop wildfires, not the this is a really stupid idea kind of way. This does create some lore problems, however. Geller fields were invented during the dark age of technology, before Psykers were running around everywhere. Powering them with something that didn't exist is naturally impossible. Additionally, that's a whole lot of people the Imperium has to chew through, since now every single ship needs not only use a Psyker to travel, but also needs to replace them quite frequently. And if we really want to double down on the issues, in some of the old source books for the Rogue Trader RPG, there were descriptions of different patterns of Geller fields which seemed to be entirely mechanical. That being said, I do have some counter-arguments. The idea of logistics is something that, let's be honest with ourselves, doesn't have a very firm relationship with 40k. Goofy-ass lore blurbs are what the setting is built on, and when you travel at FTL speeds by jumping into hell, then how much is logic worth anyways? If the Imperium wants to waste billions of Psykers annually by using them as ship batteries, then who are we to judge? As for the numbers specifically, at least, that's something that newer lore actually fixes a little bit. Psychic Awakening saw countless more Psykers being awakened amongst mankind as the Great Rift tore across the galaxy. With all these new Psykers, the logistical issues of using them as batteries for Geller fields is much less prevalent. And I don't think it's ever been specified there needs to be a certain grade of Psyker for it to work, just that you need a Psyker. Grab some weaker ones for the merchant ships and plug them in. And with the Dark Age of technology, it's not a stretch to say those Geller fields were different in what powered them. Some form of tech might have been a replacement for the Psyker. Alternatively, the warp was more stable back then, so maybe those Geller fields were ultimately weaker, but due to the circumstances of their use, they didn't need to be as strong as Imperial ones. Together, the Astronomicon and Geller fields are what make warp travel possible for the Imperium. Without the Astronomicon, no one would know where they're going well enough to make long-distance jumps, being limited to, at best, a series of smaller jumps across space. Travel times would be exponentially longer, and desperately needed reinforcements would never make it in time to their destinations. Without Geller fields, ships would enter the warp and get swarmed by demons as often as not. And to be fair as possible to the Imperium, on the large scale, both of these things work incredibly well. The countless millions of merchant ships and military patrols not actively seeking out conflict perform their duties with minimal issue. Travel times are accurate enough that anything from military campaigns to shipments of food to hive worlds mostly make it on time, with delays that quite frankly aren't even necessarily worse than real-life travel delays. Anyone who's had to spend their whole day in an airport because of a delay knows that shit just happens on occasion. Genuinely, on the large scale, Imperial warp travel is incredibly reliable for the dangers and difficulties inherent in using hell as a method of commuting to work. That being said, things can still go wrong all the time. How interesting would it be to talk about if things didn't regularly go wrong? The simplest thing that can happen is the Geller field fails. If that happens, you're at the mercy of the warp to not flood your ship with demons, and the warp being the warp, that's asking for a lot. Theoretically, you can get through a warp jump without a Geller field, in the same way you can sail the Atlantic in a canoe. You can do it, you just really shouldn't. It's opening the door for any demon noticing you passing by to pop in for a visit. Even with a fully functioning Geller field, demons can still break through the ship if they try hard enough and are sufficiently powerful. It's just that a lot of the time it isn't much worth the effort required. Nurgle and Slanesh even have specific ways to dick with ships traveling through the warp. Nurgle has the Geller pox, which infects a failed Geller field and causes every engineer around it to turn into zombies while the generator shits out demons and whatnot. The Geller field does need to be broke for it to happen, but even the slightest issue is enough. Better make sure all the screws are nice and tight, otherwise it's time for Nurgle's demon diarrhea. Slanesh meanwhile has the Lady of Voids. If the Astronomicon is a lighthouse, the Lady of Voids is a siren, luring unsuspecting navigators and Imperial ships to their doom. Even if everything's working perfectly though, we do have issues that just happen as a result of warp travel. Time travel is not only possible, but somewhat expected. Sometimes it's not time travel as it is a delay. A travel time of 2 weeks took 2 weeks and 3 days. That's again the kind of thing that happens in real life with normal weather. But when 2 weeks turns into 2,000 years, we have entered time travel territory, and when you exit the warp at an earlier date than when you entered it, there is inarguably time travel occurring. Sometimes a crew can be dead from the jump, but a warp time travel occurrence means people can see them after they're dead. That happens in the Rogue Trader Omnibus. The main character was part of an Imperial fleet, and after a warp jump, he saw one of the ships was completely devoid of life. Cue another warp jump, and he was talking in a meeting with the very captain of the doomed vessel. He didn't mention them dying because he didn't feel like it would make a difference, the warp having already sealed their fate, and if I remember correctly, everyone else involved in the conversation did the same thing. Sometimes Imperial ships will jump to a distress signal, arrive and find nothing, and then get assaulted by enemies. They send out a distress signal, which is then picked up by none other than themselves. Plenty of more minor issues can happen too. Small mutations from warp exposure, bits of the crew going insane, damage to the ship. Warp travel is extremely dangerous even when all the proper precautions are taken. The film Event Horizon, in spite of not being a 40K film, is considered by many to be a soft prequel to the setting because what it depicts can pretty handily be explained by a warp jump going wrong. Once you cross the barrier between reality and unreality, your ship getting possessed is honestly one of the lesser issues you might face. The Astronomicon itself also has inherent problems with it. Perhaps the most worrying is that one day it's gonna go out. The light bulb will burn out about the same time the Emperor does, and the Golden Throne creeps closer to failure with every day that passes. I would bet my life on this never actually happening, because then the setting implodes, or if it does happen, there'll be some miraculous out-of-nowhere fix to keep it around, but it is a danger that will eventually happen, author fiat notwithstanding. As a lighthouse, it can also be used by anyone with the eyes to see it. That's why the Tyranids are beelining it towards Terra, and anyone else with the capability can use it to navigate just as well as any human navigator does. This isn't an issue with traveling per se, but something that could pose a problem to the Imperium if GW didn't hate Xenos. And another mundane problem it has is that the Astronomicon has a maximum distance you can see it at, around 50,000 light years, give or take a few tens of thousand depending on circumstances. The farther you go, the less clear it is until it's impossible to see, turning every warp jump into essentially a blind one. Among other reasons, that's why the contents of the edges of Segmentum Ultima are largely unknown to the Imperium. No one wants to explore areas the Astronomicon doesn't light. Warp storms are another problem anyone traveling the warp faces. It's just what it sounds like. In a given area, the warp is all sorts of messed up and violent, making warp travel basically impossible. Once again, you can try it and can theoretically live, but the only people who are doing that are folks with ultramarine grade plot armor or better. For the most part, a jump made in a warp storm is consigning everyone on board the ship to a gruesome end. These block out the light of the Astronomicon, rendering warp travel even more dangerous. The Great Rift blocks off the Astronomicon from half the galaxy as well, making it somehow even shittier than it already was. Fun fact though, warp storms are purely localized to the warp. They aren't actually rifts into real space, it's only the warp that's acting up, while real space is unaffected by warp storms. If you use one of the FTL methods that don't utilize the warp to some extent, or you don't mind waiting several years to travel between systems at sublight speeds, travel is perfectly possible because real space is unaffected. There are also warp gates for those of you who want a bit more certainty in your warp travel. Though still warp travel, warp gates are essentially wormholes that lead from one fixed point to another. They're damn near perfectly safe and are just about the only spots in the galaxy you can enter the warp without some kind of protection. Unfortunately, they're incredibly rare. No one even knows if they're natural or artificial, and the line only gets blurrier because some of them have been enhanced through artificial methods, but their origins might still be natural. They could be an old one thing, since a warp gate is pretty similar to the northern and southern polar gates of Chaos in Warhammer Fantasy, but even if they are artificial like that, no one knows how to make them anymore. Any that are found become natural hotbeds of activity for no other reason than their safety and reliability. Even if the route they lead you on is a bit out of the way compared to normal warp jumps, that level of security is worth the extended travel times. They still have problems, of course. Some of them do lead into the warp rather than back into the materium, and for the rest, just because they lead to real space doesn't mean they lead to safety. Jumping into a black hole isn't much better than jumping into the warp, even if your soul is probably better off from that particular death. Chaos also, of course, makes use of warp travel in ways that are both safer and far more dangerous than the Imperium. On the plus side, Chaos Space Marines are devoted to Chaos, and as such will have less need of a Geller field since they may well have blessings of one or several Chaos gods backing them up. Nurgle, for instance, probably won't dick around too much with the Death Guard's warp jumps. And since they more or less live in the warp, being stuck in the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years and even still largely confined to the Great Rift, mutations don't really mean much to them either. Living in the warp has made even the Marines of Khorne who despise sorcery at least moderately proficient at navigating its currents. On the other hand, they're inundated in the warp with minimal protection. It's still incredibly dangerous, and just because it's less likely to kill them doesn't mean it's not a very real possibility, and in some ways it's even worse. The Chaos Gods are all roughly equally happy to insult Imperial ships. Chaos vessels, meanwhile, might have one god maybe backing them up, two gods that would be fine if they're killed, and one god that would be ecstatic if you sunk into the warp and died. Even for undivided warbands, the best you can hope for is apathy from the big four Chaos Gods, and them leaving your survival to your own ability and the whims of the warp itself. Not for the faint of heart, but ultimate power and demonhood are in their eyes worth the price. Tau FTL is in part where warp travel being better and worse between factions comes into play, although to a lesser extent than the green goobers we'll be talking about shortly. The Tau F2 FTL methods I could find, one of which is a warp drive. The warp is often described as an ocean, and much like almost every science fiction setting ever, the whole concept of navies and space travel is likened to sailors voyaging across the sea. Imperial warp drives, however, I would wager are closer to a submarine, diving headfirst into the warp and emerging back above water, or rather back into real space once the voyage is over. The Tau Ether drive, or gravitic drive, meanwhile, is much closer to properly sailing the warp because it only skims the surface. Rather than a submarine, it's almost like a rock skipping across the water. They briefly enter the warp for a little bit and then head right back out before making another jump and repeating the process. This, of course, has pros and cons, and this time we'll go through the bad things first. It's far slower than Imperial warp drives in pretty much all ways. The Tau can't jump across the galaxy nearly as quick as the Imperium, nor can they jump for as long as an Imperial equivalent can. Being several times slower than an Imperial drive, this means the Tau can't respond to threats nearly as quickly as the Imperium can, nor can they do so with nearly as wide a range of forces. The Imperium can call for reinforcements from sectors away, the Tau have to make do with solar systems away. An issue not inherent with the drive itself is the general lack of Geller fields the Tau have. A Geller field isn't a camouflage system, it's a shield of reality to keep the warp out. The Tau don't have this. If a Tau ship is noticed by the denizens of the warp, there's little that can be done to prevent them from assaulting it. Tau ships are also entirely reliant on computational power to navigate the warp, which, while possible, requires absurd levels of computer power to do, and at the end of the day will never be fully reliable. Chaos is predictable in that you can predict what any of the Chaos Gods want at a given moment, but the warp is a nightmare of random bullshit at the best of times. Trying to make 2 + 2 = 4 is impossible as often as not. That being said, the pros outweigh the cons in my opinion in no small part because of the Tau galactic position. The Imperium needs to make quicker warp jumps at the expense of total safety due to their position as the galactic superpower. With the threats they face, they absolutely have to send in reinforcements from across the entire galaxy sometimes. The Tau, meanwhile, don't really face threats on that scale yet. I'm not totally downplaying them. They've faced monstrous threats before, such as Tyranid High fleets and Ork Was, but not on the scale of the Imperium. How concentrated they are is another reason they don't need the speed of Imperial warp jumps. Your reinforcements being limited to only those within a few solar systems means a lot less when that's where they'd be coming from anyways. Even if the Tau could cross the galaxy in an instant, it wouldn't matter because no Tau reinforcements are coming from across the galaxy. Similarly, no expeditions to expand their empire are going that far. I'm sure you could find the occasional Tau ship anywhere in space. It's a big galaxy out there, who's to say the Tau version of an explorer fleet isn't out there somewhere, but no massed expansion like that. As for safety, them lacking Geller fields isn't that much of a pain. The far smaller warp presence the Tau have means they're far harder to detect even in the warp itself. It can absolutely still happen, and if it does, it's probably game over, but the race essentially has Halo active camo on at all times when it comes to demons. In fact, I'd say that's a pretty good way to compare the Imperium and the Tau when it comes to warp travel. Geller fields are like when you pick up an overshield in a multiplayer match. The Tau, meanwhile, have race-wide active camouflage. Their auxiliary races have a far greater warp presence, but their numbers aren't usually enough to present a beacon to any demons in the warp compared to all the Tau. They're also not entering the warp nearly as deeply, further limiting the chance of demonic incursion. And as for them relying on computational power to navigate, while trying to navigate the warp with technology is very unreliable, the Tau have gone through several sphere expansions thus far. Clearly it works well enough for them, or there'd be no Tau Empire. The shorter jump ranges absolutely help with this, since plotting a warp jump over a few systems is far easier than a warp jump over an entire segmentum. Things can still go wrong, like with the 4th sphere expansion causing most of the expeditionary force to be killed by demons and the rest to go at least a little bit insane, but overall it's still fairly reliable. The Tau also have access to the ZFR Horizon Accelerator engine, and depending on how you read the lore, this is now the main and only thing they have. If my understanding of how the 4th sphere expansion worked is correct, then the etheric drive may have been retconned to have been invented here with it, but for the sake of fun and having more options, I like to think they're both available now, if nothing else. Everything's canon, but nothing's true after all. What's one more FTL method compared to some other shit GW has tried to push? The ZFR is essentially just a lightspeed engine. It doesn't quite reach the speed of light, but due to actual, real, relativistic science, the crew experiences time at a far slower rate compared to the rest of the galaxy. While this does mean reinforcements are coming in slow as hell, even compared to the previous method of Tau FTL, at least for sphere expansions, it does mean the crew of your ships won't age to death by the time they get where they need to be. The pros and cons of this are fairly predictable. The only real con is the speed, but because of how slow it is compared to everything else, it's a major one. This is a sub-light speed engine. They're not actually going at FTL speeds with it. The reinforcements are not arriving on time. Alpha Centauri in real life is about 4 light years away. If the Tau were trying to assist a system of an equivalent distance, the fight would be 4 years over one way or another by the time they actually arrived. On the plus side, it doesn't interact with the warp at all. There are 0 chances of warp nonsense happening with this thing. So if the Tau were to be smart about things, here's how I'd organize it. Have your military ships outfitted with the etheric drives or whatever the semi-retconned 4th sphere expansion equivalent is. They need to get where they need to be going fast. Have their colony ships and other less time-pressing matters use the ZRF drive though. The planet will probably still be there by the time it arrives, so there's no need to put the pedal to the metal to colonize it. Why only use one when both options are perfectly valid for different circumstances? Now here's where the biggest part of a warp drive's quality being relative comes into play. If you asked your average Imperial ship captain, be they Navy, merchant, or rogue trader, to turn off the Geller field and broadcast their presence into the warp, you'd be shot on the spot. If you asked the average Ork to do these things, they'd also shoot you on the spot for suggesting any such features be turned on, or were there to begin with. In theory, Orks actually do have something resembling Geller fields, presumably only ever used when a properly important war boss doesn't want his boys dying before the big fight starts. I have found out, by the way, that whenever I'm talking about the Orks, I've started saying boys and fight like that naturally. I'm not even trying to do it. Green really is best, I guess. But back to the topic, their Geller field is just them jamming metal plates and other crap resembling teeth onto their ship to scare off the demons. This may work because of their collective Ork Gestalt field / their belief in it working making it work. It may not work at all, or it may work because demons know the Orks are more excited they showed up than the demons are to eat their souls. Think of it like a robbery. I gotta imagine any would-be thief would be a lot less sure about mugging someone who's smiling ear to ear, armed to the teeth, and covered in plate mail with the words "Born to Kill" written in crayon on their breastplate. For the rest of their warp drive tech, it's the usual Ork affair of being anything from stuff they stole from other races to stuff a mech boy cobbled together in a manic frenzy. Ork FTL tech is wildly unsafe for both the inhabitants of the ship as well as anyone in the vicinity. To once again make the comparison, it reminds me of the different levels of slip space travel in Halo. Humanity rips a hole into slip space, the Covenant do it with surgical precision, and the Foreigners had complete mastery. In this analogy, the Orks are bashing open a hole with a sledgehammer and calling unreality a pussy until it either backs down or produces a fight for them, both of which are good outcomes. For literally anyone else in the setting, this is the worst thing possible. Demons are incredibly likely, health and safety would make even the Imperium, shall we say, lax treatment of its ship's crew look OSHA compliant, and another key thing is that half the time an Ork ship isn't even a ship. It's a space hulk they hijacked. In addition to demons, this means they're likely to be crawling with gene stealers as well, and landing on the planet they're heading towards is something closer to an asteroid impact. The ships making up a space hulk are also of varying functionality, meaning the engines or guns of one might suddenly fire and rip the whole thing apart. But consider, viewer, that all of these things are negatives to a species that can be considered sane, and despite what some people may tell you, sanity is not something you can really apply to the Orks as we know it. I'm not saying this as a criticism, they're having a blast. Demons showing up is only a problem if you consider a demonic incursion a traumatic experience rather than in-flight entertainment, same with gene stealers. Their landings almost always being of the crashing variety means that they don't have to waste time getting to the fight, and starting the fight with an asteroid impact is one hell of an explosive entrance which Orks also appreciate. As for general safety measures, sure it sucks to be the Ork who gets thrown into space after a couple of decaying compartments finally give out. Just don't be that particular Ork, bro, or have the Grots go and fix things. That's what they exist for. Honorable mention to the shock attack gun, which works by opening a portal through the warp, firing a snotling through it, and then opening a second portal near the enemy so the snotling is launched onto whatever it's pointed at. This, in theory, given the warp, could be used as a method of achieving FTL speed, although given the unreliability involved, I think it's safe to say this shouldn't be your chosen method of travel. Ork FTL is in general like the rest of Ork tech. Basically garbage, as much as a hazard to the user as it is to their enemies, but too fun to pass up on using. It's also worth mentioning that during the War of the Beast, the Orks had seemingly utilized another method of FTL travel called subspace, utilizing both their Wa field and gravity. Not terribly Orky from my understanding, since being its own little realm meant no demons to fight mid-flight, but certainly a more effective method of travel. They would use it to basically teleport an entire attack moon right above a planet, because fuck you, anyone below these things. The Eldar, of course, have to travel across the galaxy, but the circumstances of their fall have made it a bit trickier. In the glory days of the Eldar Empire, nearly anything was possible. They could waltz right through the warp if they wanted, although probably not for long on account of Assyrian's edict dividing the Materium and the Immaterium. You may notice a lot of Eldar spaceships also have sails on them. In the past, the ancient Eldar sailed through the warp, treating it like even more of an ocean than the rest of the people in 40k do. All of this was of course done away with the birth of Slaanesh. Now the extent of their interaction with the warp is psyker powers and warp spiders jumping in and out of it, something far too short range to truly be called FTL travel. Thankfully, they have an alternative method of FTL travel to call upon, one that in most ways is far superior to what the rest of the factions have access to. The Eldar Webway, perhaps more accurately called the Old Ones Webway since they built it and the Eldar just sort of set up shop there after they died. While the metaphor isn't perfect, if the warp is the ocean and the Materium is above the ocean, the Webway is like a crocodile half submerged into the water. Not quite in the warp, but not quite material. It sits between these two realities. In the days of the War in Heaven, the Eldar were taught by the Old Ones how to navigate the Webway as well as expand upon it, so they do have some claim to it beyond squatters' rights. While the Eldar could also use the warp to travel, the Webway is also very convenient. If you know where you're going, you don't need to plot a course like a sailor charting waters and taking storms into account. You can just go from point A to point B and you're there. Better yet, this is the only mass-scale FTL method in 40k that you can use on foot. The Exodite animation GW put out shows Titans walking out of the Webway, and there's nothing stopping an individual from waltzing in and out of it for funsies. The Webway does have some wacky things about it, of course. It's still magical in nature, so it's hardly normal. Time and distance will still have the at best tenuous relationship with how they're perceived by anyone in the Webway. A year walking through it to reach an exit may turn out to be mere seconds in real space, or vice versa. This, however, is more of a feature than a bug like it tends to be with warp travel, since not only is that how it's an FTL method instead of just a big tunnel, but it's far more predictable here. A given portion of the Webway may act all wonky, but you can usually plan for it. Up and down may be relative, but gravity most likely won't suddenly reverse and you go plummeting shining into the ceiling. It also keeps you safe from chaos to some extent. Most prominently with the Dark Eldar, of course, since Kamara being within it is how they survived the birth of Slaanesh, but I would say it can be assumed it extends to other corruption as well, if only a little bit. If it didn't shield you from chaos, then why would the Emperor want to barge into it to hide humanity from chaos? The Eldar are the only ones who can utilize it to the fullest extent, of course, but with a map just about anyone can use it. Humanity has used it plenty of times, and the Emperor's whole plan was to take it over for mankind, although I believe it was the end of the death that had Vulcan look at what was left of the Webway project and wonder if it was truly possible to begin with. In my eternal bias in favor of the Eldar, I'd have to say no, it wasn't, but Vulcan also wasn't there working on it, so I'm sure he didn't have all the knowledge needed to make that judgment properly. The Necrons also make use of it through one of their newer bits of lore known as Dolmen Gates. Dolmen Gates are like one-way hackjob wormholes into the Webway. Created by the Catan known as the Burning One, they briefly rip open a hole into the Webway so Necrons could flood into it and then exit through another Dolmen Gate. This allowed them access, but the limits of it come from the nature of the Webway itself. See, the Webway is at least partially alive, and tends to not like things that aren't the Eldar or the Old Ones mucking about in it. If some random guardsman enters, they're probably fine, but something like a Chaos Demon is going to be swarmed with the crystalline spider-like guardians of the Webway as soon as possible. The Webway can seal any holes into it, constrict passages to squeeze invaders out, and even cut them off entirely to avoid contamination. The process is by no means perfect, since after at least 65 million years, anything will start to break down eventually. The Webway has decayed far from what it once was, and the Eldar on the whole have lost the knowledge of how to truly maintain and rebuild it. But still, it's alive, and if you have ill will towards the Space Elves, it'll make its displeasure towards you known, which is why the Necrons have to be careful and use those Dolmen Gates strategically and quickly. It's also part of the reason Ahriman can never have nice things. The whole thing also vents excess warp energy that may be inside of it into the Materium, causing all sorts of problems for anyone who happens to live around one of those vents. Those are hardly the only hazards of the Webway to anyone trying to use it, but the rest of them are largely more downsides towards whoever is unlucky enough to trip into them, rather than something the Webway can do to you. Traveling the Webway, for instance, leaves you open to encountering either the Harlequins or the Dark Eldar. Both of those factions live in the Webway, and both of them almost certainly don't want you in it. Or at least they don't want you in it with free reign. The Dark Eldar don't need an explanation as to why they're a hazard. Once a Cabal realizes they don't need to enter real space to gather all the slaves and future arts and craft supplies in the form of your bones that they need, they're going to rush you. The Harlequins, meanwhile, on a whole, are much more conducive to negotiating and working with other races, but that comes with the general caveat that you aren't inside their house. They will kill you stone cold dead if you are, and unlike the rest of the Eldar, they may very well have kept knowledge on how to rebuild and repair it. Kegarek's an Eldar god, and if anyone in the setting has that knowledge to pass on, it's him. And either way, pissing off a god is a bad idea in general. You can also just get lost. It's a giant intergalactic maze. Wandering it blindly is a great way to end up dead. You can wind up in outer space and suffocate, near a sun and burn to death, inside a particularly unpleasant planetary gate and be murdered, or hell, accidentally end up in Kamara. Since it's intergalactic, you might just starve to death looking for a way out. Boring way to go, but entirely possible. Warp incursions are also a frequent hazard, with entire tunnels often being lost to the warp as it breaches into the Webway. For all the defenses the Webway has, ranging from those inherent to it to those that come from the people living in it, the Webway is under siege from the warp at all times. It isn't necessarily a losing battle, but neither are there signs the Webway will win out in the end. If the Webway falls, the hopes of all the Eldar go with it, so everyone from Craftworlders to Kamarites will fight tooth and nail to keep it safe. In spite of all the dangers, however, it is still without fail the best FTL method in the setting. New passages do naturally form, even if far slower than when they were constructed. It can heal itself, if again slower than the damage is usually inflicted, and if you have the right knowledge, it's faster and more reliable than anything else. It isn't just for safety the Eldar use it, it's because it enables them to strike without warning anywhere in the galaxy. Sure, a Webway gate means you can predict where they'll come from, but almost no one who isn't the Eldar knows where a given Webway gate is, and no one who isn't Kegarak knows where they all are. At any given moment, an Aspect Warrior force can show up outside your house because what you thought was a telephone tower was actually a Webway gate, primed to vomit out angry elves on command. And given both the magical nature of it and the general ignorance of most people about the Webway, I imagine you can never be 100% sure you got rid of a given gate, even if you blew it up physically. There are a variety of other FTL methods in the setting, but a lot of them aren't that much to go into. For example, the other Necron FTL method is something that's been semi-retcon, but also not quite, because Battlefleet Gothic kind of undid it. Inertialess drives are a scientific way to breach the light barrier. No warp travel or anything required. No risk of demons, and as long as the engine doesn't crap out on you, no risk of anything, really. This is the kind of thing that makes the Webway look like it came out of a used car dealership, which is why I imagine it was largely retconned. However, Battlefleet Gothic does bring them back as an ability for Necron ships. It sure enough basically lets you teleport, but the drawback is that they're fairly limited in range and it takes an ungodly amount of time to recharge. Honestly, it's a nice way of making the older and newer lore connect if they keep using it like that. Inertialess drives are peerless for getting a quick tactical advantage, and in a pinch can be used for long-distance movement, but for more practical large-scale usage, breaching into the Webway is the better option. The Tyranids, meanwhile, have a funky little bioship called a Narval. How this thing works specifically is a mystery, let's call it. Liberties with science is one way to put it, but 40k isn't really science fiction, so who cares? But it essentially allows the Tyranids to create gravitational corridors and compress space in a result that sounds far closer to traditional wormholes to allow the Tyranids to achieve FTL speeds. Apparently, it can also massively disrupt the gravity of smaller planets and moons, causing tectonic activity ranging from earthquakes to volcanic eruptions. Solar flares aren't even off the table. Now, logically speaking, this makes zero sense. This thing isn't even a mile long. There's absolutely no way it could create enough gravity to cause a star to erupt into solar flares or a planet's mantle to begin going haywire. But 40k is 40k, so I guess the funny bug ship can just do that. Presumably the Tyranids don't just make a million of these things and destroy everything they fight with gravity waves, because then there'd be nothing left to eat. That and these things are otherwise defenseless, but if you can cause a planet's mantle to go nuclear, then surely you could weaponize that in space. But we probably shouldn't question the logic of Tyranid bioships, or the hive mind in general. After all, I'm pretty sure someone online figured out that nebulae would be the best source of nutrients for the Tyranids rather than people, but they don't chase after space clouds terribly often. Sorcery and psyker powers can also be used to transport yourself across the galaxy, but calling this FTL does feel like stretching things a bit. You're certainly moving across the galaxy at FTL speed, so it does count, but usually you think of hyperdrives and starships with that kind of thing, you know? Nevertheless, it can be done. Some word-bearers teleported onto Macragge via sorcery during the Horus Heresy, and Eldrad himself seemed to come and go as he pleased on the Blueberry homeworld as well during the same book the word-bearers did it. I want to say it was Unremembered Empire this happened in, but off the top of my head I can't remember, which is fitting if nothing else given the title, I suppose. That kind of thing not only requires a substantial amount of power for individuals, but it'll scale massively the more people you want to teleport. It can of course be done. Teleporting with wizardry isn't uncommon in things like D&D, let alone 40k. But if you want to transverse the hellscape of the warp with an army, you better have every precaution possible taken before you do it. And those are just about all the main methods of FTL travel in 40k. Almost all of them are incredibly dangerous, the ones that aren't are incredibly slow, and overall, they all kinda suck. But they suck in that 40k way, where if they didn't suck, they wouldn't be nearly as fun. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the FTL to my 40k, sending me forward at breakneck speeds to glory and or doom. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Alright, so I had a Mechanicus moment. The way I mod the game FTL is through some launcher or other, but the problem is I downloaded it and did everything with the launcher like 8 years ago. I don't even remember the name of where I got it from. I no longer remember how it works or where to put files to make new mods appear in the game, and quite frankly, I'm scared to investigate in case I ruin everything. All criticism of the Imperium for getting stuff I've ever had, I'm now revoking. I get it now. I completely understand how things can just get lost.